Hey guys, tonight we step barefoot into a lamplit museum of mud and memory, where a single list on baked clay tries to hold the weight of centuries like it is nothing more than a grocery note. You can almost smell it, that warm, dusty scent of fired earth, and hear the soft tick of a reed stylus as it presses tiny wedge marks into a tablet that still feels slightly alive in your imagination. This is the Sumerian King List, and it might read like history, it may read like myth, and it could also read like a carefully staged performance of power, the kind that makes you wonder who gets to define reality when the only evidence is a few calm lines in an ancient hand. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm, what if imagination, and we will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And yes, you probably won't survive this, not because of monsters, but because your modern brain will try to do math at bedtime and immediately file a complaint. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, drop your location and your local time in the comments, because it is oddly cozy to picture this story drifting across bedrooms and night shifts and quiet kitchens around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in the low glow of an ancient city that is both real and slightly out of focus, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The air feels dry in your throat. Somewhere nearby, water moves in a canal with a slow and patient sound. And beyond that, the plain stretches out in muted browns and silvers, as if the earth itself is holding its breath. Most historians agree that in southern Mesopotamia, long before empires with banners and trumpets, people built cities with temples, storehouses, canals, and a deep obsession with counting things. Grain, sheep, jars of oil, days, seasons, taxes, promises. It is not romantic exactly, but it is human. And the evidence we do have points to a world where keeping records becomes a kind of survival skill. Now imagine the simplest kind of power. Not a crown, not a sword, but a list. A list says I remember. A list says you belong here, and you do not. A list says this happened in this order, and if you disagree, you better bring your own clay tablet. That is the mood you carry as you approach the Sumerian King List, a text that survives in multiple copies from later periods, each one acting like a careful echo of something older. What is broadly accepted is that it is a real composition from ancient Mesopotamia that names cities and rulers, and it lines them up as if history is a neat row of jars on a shelf. And then, with a straight face that only a scribe can manage, it tells you that some kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. That is where the night air gets a little weirder. You step closer, and the words start to take shape in your mind, as if you are watching someone read them aloud in a classroom that smells like reeds and wet clay. Kingship, the list says, arrives. It descends. It moves from city to city. It is not exactly a job application. It is more like a cosmic baton. Most historians agree that this language reflects the religious and political worldview of Mesopotamia, where rulership is tied to divine favor temples and the idea that the universe has an order. One interpretation is that the list is not just recording rulers, it is also instructing you on how to think about power as something granted, transferable, and sanctioned. And what if you are not reading a timeline at all, but listening to a lullaby that teaches obedience and awe in the same slow rhythm? Let me rephrase that more carefully, because this is where people can get carried away. The list is suggestive, not conclusive when it comes to literal truth. The evidence is thin for taking the early reign lengths as real calendar years, and if the evidence is thin, we will say so. Archaeology suggests that humans in early Mesopotamia lived normal human lives with all the usual inconveniences like bad teeth and heat and the need to haul water and argue about property lines. So, when the list says a king ruled for 28,800 years, a more cautious explanation could be that the number is symbolic, or that it is using a different kind of counting, or that it is making a point about grandeur rather than recording a birthday and a death date. Still, you cannot help it. Your brain does the thing brains do. It pictures a king sitting on a throne for 28,000 years, slowly becoming part of the furniture. There is a light joke hiding here because if you have ever sat through a 2-hour meeting that should have been an email, you already know what eternity feels like. Now scale that up to 10,000 years and imagine the agenda. The king list begins in a place with a name that feels like a soft sigh in the mouth, Eridu. What's broadly accepted is that Eridu is one of the earliest known urban centers in southern Mesopotamia, associated with deep antiquity and temple tradition. The list treats Eridu like the first stage where kingship touches down. One interpretation is that this is a claim of legitimacy. If your city is first, then your authority feels inevitable. If you are the birthplace of kingship, then everyone else is borrowing. And what if in the candle glow of a temple, the idea of being first matters more than being accurate, because firstness is a kind of magic? The list then offers names that feel like they belong to a world half behind a curtain. Alulim, Alalngar. These are not names that show up in the same way as later rulers tied to better-known dynasties and inscriptions. The evidence we do have points to these names being preserved in a literary and scribal tradition, not confirmed by direct contemporary records from their supposed reigns. That does not automatically mean they are invented, but it does mean caution is wise. One interpretation is that the earliest portion of the list blends mythic memory with political storytelling, creating a long prelude that makes the later, more historical sections feel anchored in something ancient and unbreakable. Now you meet the numbers, and the numbers are the loudest characters in the room. The reigns are written in units that connect to Mesopotamian math, a base 60 system that shows up all over their accounting and astronomy. Most historians agree that sexagesimal counting is central to Mesopotamian culture, and you still live with it every time you count 60 seconds in a minute. So when you see reign lengths built from units like the Sar, which later tradition equates to 3,600, you are watching a culture use its favorite building blocks. A careful reading might suggest that these reigns are constructed the way a cathedral is constructed, with repeating patterns that feel meaningful even if they are not meant to be literal. It is possible that huge totals create a sense of cosmic scale, the way a storyteller might say a very long time ago, without meaning you should open a spreadsheet. And yes, some people do open spreadsheets. This is humanity. We see a big number, and our first instinct is to fight it with smaller numbers. Historians still argue whether the extreme reign lengths in the earliest part of the list reflect symbolic numerology, political propaganda, memories of multiple leaders compressed into one figure, or something else entirely. That debate is part of the reason this topic is so bedtime friendly. It is a puzzle that does not demand you solve it. It invites you to drift near it. You keep walking in your mind past canals and temple courtyards, past stacks of barley and baskets of dates, past a row of students learning to shape wedges into meaning. Archaeology suggests that scribal schools trained people to copy texts with care, and that copying itself becomes a technology of memory. One interpretation is that the King List is as much a product of these schools as it is a record of rulers. It is possible it was used to teach students not only writing, but worldview. Here is the order of cities. Here is the order of kingship. Here is how to speak about legitimacy, as if it is weather, as if it simply arrives. And what if you can hear the reed stylus again, tapping softly like rain on a roof, reminding you that history often survives because someone found it worth practicing. At this point, the calm mainstream ground is that the Sumerian King List is a genuine ancient text that mixes mythic and historical material, and that it reflects how Mesopotamians thought about rulership order and divine legitimacy. The evidence we do have points to later sections, aligning more closely with rulers and dynasties that appear in other records, while the earliest section feels more like a mythic, deep-time prologue. That is the safe, steady floor beneath your feet. Now we step into the mist just a little, and we do it carefully. A fringe idea proposes that the extreme lifespans are not symbolic at all, but literal, and that they hint at beings who are not human, sometimes linked in modern imagination to the Anunnaki. To be clear, this is debated and it is not widely accepted. In mainstream scholarship, the Anunnaki are deities within Mesopotamian religion, not confirmed visitors, and the huge numbers are typically treated as literary or symbolic. Still, the fringe idea persists because it scratches a very human itch, the desire to treat myth as a report. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the question becomes less about proving anything and more about noticing why the idea feels compelling. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the list is less a ledger and more a mirror reflecting what people wanted to believe about authority? You pause with that thought and you let it soften. You are not here to declare a hidden truth. We are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. So, you imagine Eridu, again, not as a modern excavation site, but as a living place. The temple rises like a stepped hill of mud brick. The air smells of river reeds and smoke from cooking fires. A priest pours water into a basin and watches the ripples. A scribe presses wedges into clay. A leader listens because being written down is a kind of immortality. And what if in that moment, immortality is the real message of the giant numbers? Not that one person lived forever, but that kingship as an idea wanted to feel eternal. Your modern mind, still trying to be helpful, whispers that 241,200 years is a lot. It is almost comical. It is also strangely soothing because it makes your own worries feel small, like a pebble in a riverbed. You are not meant to take it like a birth certificate. You are meant to feel the scale. And as you stand there in the hush of the ancient night, you realize the King List is doing something clever. It takes the messy noise of real human politics and wraps it in a blanket of order. It gives you a sequence. It gives you a feeling that history has a spine. One interpretation is that this is the oldest kind of comfort story, told by states, told by temples, told by people who needed the world to make sense after floods and famines and rival cities. A more cautious explanation could be that the earliest kings are part of a mythic framework that makes later claims of rule feel weightier. And what if the list is a bridge between two kinds of time, the human time of harvests and generations, and the story time where numbers stretch like shadows at sunset? You take one more slow breath and you keep moving forward through the warm dust and the soft fan hum in your room, carrying the image of a clay tablet as if it is a small, heavy charm in your pocket, something that clicks gently when you walk. You keep walking along the river's edge, where the water pretends to be calm, while quietly doing what rivers do best, rewriting the world one grain at a time. The mud under your feet is soft, then firm, then soft again, and the air carries that damp mineral smell that always shows up when fresh silt has been spread like a thin blanket. Somewhere a reed bed rustles, and you can hear insects conducting their tiny nighttime orchestra like they were hired for ambiance. If your room is quiet, you might notice your own fan humming along, and for a second, it sounds like the river, too steady and indifferent. Most historians agree that the lands of southern Mesopotamia were shaped by water in a way that feels almost unfair. The Tigris and Euphrates do not just provide life, they also demand attention, constant maintenance, and a tolerance for surprise. Archaeology suggests that ancient communities built canals, levees, and drainage systems, and the evidence we do have points to periodic flooding and shifting waterways that could disrupt farms' neighborhoods and even the outlines of cities. A more cautious explanation could be that this is enough to explain why flood stories show up so often, not as a single event you can circle on a calendar, but as a recurring fear that becomes a shared language. Now, the King List introduces a particular kind of sentence, the kind that feels like a door closing with a soft click. There is a line where the world is divided into two moods, before the flood and after. One interpretation is that this is less a weather report and more a narrative reset, a way to say everything changes here, so the story gets to start fresh. If you have ever spilled coffee on a notebook and decided it was now a new notebook, you understand the emotional logic. Only in this case, the coffee is the river and the notebook is civilization. It's possible that the flood functions as a boundary marker between mythic time and human time. The earliest rain lengths are so enormous that they feel like they belong to a dream, while the later portions begin to look more like the kind of history that can connect to the rise of city dynasties. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is a useful way to read the structure without claiming the numbers are literal. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, because the evidence is uneven, and the surviving copies were made long after the earliest rulers they describe. You drift with that thought as the river glides by, and you imagine the practical side of floods in a city of mud brick. Water seeps into walls like gossip, slowly, persistently showing up in places it was never invited. Floors turn to paste. Granaries become sad, soggy tragedies. You are not battling dragons, you are battling wet storage. It is hard to feel heroic while carrying a jar of grain that weighs more than your dignity. This is the kind of reality check that makes ancient life feel very human. You probably won't survive it mostly because you would complain about the mud, then accidentally step into a canal, then try to negotiate with the canal as if it cares. Archaeology suggests that people adapted to this watery unpredictability with planning labor and community organization. The evidence we do have points to irrigation being central, which means cooperative work, and rules, which means scribes and administrators, and the gentle rise of bureaucracy. One interpretation is that flood memory, even when transformed into myth, reinforces the idea that order matters, that leadership matters, and that the universe punishes sloppiness. If you need people to respect authority, reminding them that chaos is one river tantrum away is unfortunately effective. Historians still argue whether the flood referenced in Mesopotamian tradition reflects a single catastrophic event, a blend of multiple regional floods, or a mythic motif shaped to express moral and cosmic order. That debate lives right in the middle of the story because the flood appears in more than one ancient narrative. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature includes flood accounts, including versions that later echo in other traditions. And archaeology suggests that localized flood deposits exist at some sites, even if they do not point to one universal global flood. Let me rephrase that more carefully because people love to turn the word flood into a microphone for whatever theory they already want. A flood layer in the ground can be real and meaningful without being proof of a planet-wide deluge. This might support the idea that communities remembered severe flooding and preserved it as story, but it is suggestive, not conclusive, regarding a single, all-covering event. Still, you can feel why the King List uses the flood like a hinge. A list is supposed to be orderly, floods are not. So, placing the flood in the narrative is like admitting quietly that history is vulnerable. It's possible that the scribes are acknowledging a break in memory, a moment where records, buildings, and lineages are disrupted. One interpretation is that the flood gives them permission to reorganize the sequence of kingship afterward, to present a cleaner progression of cities and rulers, even if real politics were messy, overlapping, and loud. You notice how the river keeps moving, and it feels like the river is a historian that refuses to write footnotes. It just keeps going, and whatever it touches changes shape. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the flood is not only about water, but about the fear of forgetting? Because floods do not just drown things, they bury them. They hide streets, they cover tablets, they erase the convenient parts of the past. Then later someone digs and finds broken pieces and tries to reconstruct a whole. That's basically the human condition, except with fewer shovels and more awkward family conversations. Here's a quirky tidbit, and it stays on the safe side of reality. In Mesopotamian imagination, the world is not a floating sphere in space. It is often pictured as a structured cosmos with layers, waters, above waters below, and a human realm in between. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian cosmology includes watery elements. And one interpretation is that this makes floods feel like more than weather, like a leak in the universe. You can almost picture a cosmic ceiling springing a drip and a priest looking up like seriously who forgot to patch the sky. Now for the misty edge labeled gently. A popular rumor claims that flood myths preserve memory of extraordinary celestial events like a comet meteor or sudden climate shock that people later describe in watery language. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it keeps showing up because it makes the story feel like a coded message. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less of a claim and more of a mood, humans reaching for a cause big enough to match the fear. The evidence is thin, so we say so, and we let it remain a whisper, not a headline. You keep moving through the city's imagined streets. The air is cooler near the water. A worker lifts a basket of reeds and mutters something that sounds like the ancient version of "I did not sign up for this." A scribe stays dry under an awning because, of course, the person with the writing job stays dry. It is possible the King List is doing the same thing, staying dry by turning flood chaos into a clean dividing line. One interpretation is that the flood is the story's way of wiping the slate so kingship can appear again with fresh authority, as if power itself survived the water intact. And as the night deepens, you let the river sound become softer, like your fan fading into the background, and you allow the idea to settle. The King List is not only telling you who ruled, it is teaching you how to think about time. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The solid ground is that floods shaped the land and the people. The mist is how those floods become a single dramatic hinge in memory. And what if, as the river keeps flowing, the story keeps flowing too, carrying names, numbers, and questions downstream, leaving you with the calm understanding that history is often the art of arranging what survives. You drift inland, away from the river's wet breath, and the ground firms up under your feet until it feels almost polite. The air turns drier, warmer, and carries a faint scent of smoke-baked bread and sun-heated clay. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then decides it has done enough for society and goes quiet. Your sandals whisper over packed earth. You pass low walls, storage jars, reed mats hung to dry, and a courtyard where someone is grinding grain with the steady patience of a person who has accepted that this is their entire afternoon. Most historians agree that places like Eridu sit near the beginning of urban life in Mesopotamia, with long occupation and strong links to temple culture. Archaeology suggests that early cities grew around complex social organization, irrigation, and religious institutions. And the evidence we do have points to temples as economic and administrative centers, not just spiritual hangouts. In other words, the temple is not only where you pray, it is also where the spreadsheets live, except the spreadsheet is a clay tablet, and the formula is somebody's very tired handwriting. You approach Eridu in your imagination like you are arriving at a place that is both a city and a statement. The horizon is low and wide. The sun is not harsh tonight because we are keeping this sleep friendly, but it still paints the mud brick in soft gold. A temple rises above the rooftops, layered and solid, like a small mountain made by human hands. What's broadly accepted is that Eridu became associated in later tradition with deep antiquity and with a particular god, and one interpretation is that this association helps the city claim a special kind of seniority. If kingship begins at Eridu in the King List, then Eridu is not just a place, it is the stage where the very idea of rulership first appears. And what if that is the point? Not that Eridu is literally the first city ever in an absolute sense, but that Eridu is made first in the story because stories are how humans assign meaning. You can feel the difference between living in a city and living in a city that believes it is the first. One has canals, the other has destiny. You walk through narrow lanes. Children dart past you, bare feet slapping the ground like little drum beats. A donkey complains loudly about carrying jars as if it is trying to start a union. Someone calls out prices in a small market, and you hear the clink of pottery. All of this is ordinary, and that ordinariness matters. Most historians agree that daily life in early Mesopotamian cities involved agriculture, craft production, trade, and temple-related labor and archaeology. Suggests that people ate grains, dates, and legumes, kept animals, and built with mud brick because the landscape practically hands it to you. Now, in the middle of all this normal life, you remember that the King List says kingship descends. Let me rephrase that more carefully, because it is easy to imagine a crown falling out of the sky like a dropped hat. In Mesopotamian thought, divine authority is often expressed as something granted by the gods, and from heaven can be a way of saying sanctioned by the cosmic order. One interpretation is that kingship from heaven is a theological way to justify political power. It's possible the phrase is not trying to report a literal descent, but to say, this is legitimate, do not argue with it, and also please pay your taxes. Historians still argue whether the King List's language of kingship descending from heaven reflects a purely symbolic religious formula, a specific political agenda tied to later dynasties, or a deeper memory of shifting institutions that were retroactively framed as divine. The debate matters because it changes how you read the whole composition. If you treat the text as propaganda, you watch it like a performance. If you treat it as tradition, you listen for echoes of how communities remembered their past. A careful reading might suggest it is both. The evidence we do have points to Mesopotamian scribes blending sacred language with practical record-keeping, because that is how you make authority feel natural. It is like putting a halo on a ledger. You come to the temple courtyard. The ground is swept. There is a basin of water, and a person rinses their hands with slow precision, as if cleanliness is a ritual and also a rare luxury. A priest murmurs words you cannot fully catch, and smoke curls upward from incense or burning reeds. This is where mainstream ground feels very solid. Temples mattered, gods mattered, and texts often place political order inside a sacred frame. One interpretation is that the King List begins at Eridu because the temple culture there provides a mythic foundation. And what if the list is not simply naming rulers, but blessing the entire chain of authority with the weight of the first city? Now you meet the first names again, and you let them settle like stones in your palm. Alulim, Alangar. These are the kings who rule for astonishing lengths, and the list is unbothered by your raised eyebrows. The evidence we do have points to these early names appearing in a tradition that later scribes preserve, and archaeology suggests that writing itself emerges and evolves over time, meaning our window into the earliest periods is limited. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. So we cannot confidently place Alulim in a modern timeline the way we might place a later king. That is not a failure. That is simply what it means to work with ancient fragments. A more cautious explanation could be that these names represent mythic ancestors, symbolic founders, or composite figures created by combining memories of leadership over long spans. One interpretation is that the exaggerated reigns are part of a mythic register. They signal a world closer to the gods where time stretches. And what if in the story's logic, the first city deserves first kings who feel larger than life because ordinary rulers would not match the mood? You take a moment to notice how the city feels under starlight. Mud brick walls hold warmth. The air cools gently. Somewhere a lamp flickers behind a doorway. There is a softness to it, even with all the labor and dust. And then your modern brain does something funny. It compares Eridu to a modern town trying to brand itself. You can almost hear a city council meeting. Welcome to Eridu, home of the original kingship. Please visit our gift shop. We have commemorative clay tablets, 2 for 1 on weekends. That is joke number 1, and you can keep it because laughter is a nice pillow. Now we step slightly into the mist again, carefully labeled. A fringe idea proposes that the phrase kingship from heaven might be taken literally as in outsiders arriving, bringing knowledge, organizing society, and ruling for long spans. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream scholarship treats the language as religious ideology, not evidence of visitors. To be clear, this is debated, and we will not pretend it is settled. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, what it offers is not proof, but atmosphere. It invites the question, what if the story is pointing at something else, like a memory of sudden change, technological shifts, or the shock of city life itself, later dressed in divine language? A popular rumor claims that Eridu, as a first city, might hide extraordinary origins, secret knowledge, or lost records that would explain the giant numbers. Again, the evidence is thin. Archaeology suggests gradual development, experimentation, and human adaptation, not a single cinematic arrival scene. But rumors thrive in the gaps because gaps feel like doorways. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. So you stand at the edge of the temple platform and look out across the low rooftops, and you choose to hold both moods at once. Solid ground. Early cities like Eridu are real. Their temple cultures are documented, and the King List uses them to structure memory. Mist. The earliest reigns are exaggerated beyond plausibility, and the reasons are debated. One interpretation is symbolic numerology and legitimacy building. Another, more speculative reading imagines literal long-lived rulers. And what if the truth, whatever it is less important than what the list reveals about human longing? The longing to begin with something sacred, something enormous, something that makes your own little life feel like part of a very old story. You step down from the temple platform, and as you walk, you notice a small detail you can carry forward, like a soft callback. The reed stylus. Someone nearby is shaping it, trimming the tip, testing it on a damp tablet. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. The sound is gentle, almost like rain. It is the sound of a city teaching itself to remember. And you keep moving through Eridu's quiet streets with that sound in your ears because the list is still waiting, and so are the numbers, and so is the question of what kind of time you are really walking through. The reed stylus keeps its soft rhythm as you move tap, press, lift, like a tiny metronome for an entire civilization. You can almost feel the texture of the clay tablet under your fingertips, cool at first, then warming as your hand rests on it. The wedges are small, tidy, and confident, the way writing looks when it belongs to a system that expects you to take it seriously. And you do take it seriously right up until the numbers show up again and your brain tries to sit up in bed and do long division. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian scribes used a base 60 system, and archaeology suggests that this sexagesimal approach shaped everything from accounting to timekeeping. The evidence we do have points to numbers being more than practical tools. They are cultural habits. You still inherit some of that habit every time you glance at a clock. So when the Sumerian King List gives reign lengths that feel impossible, one cautious move is to ask what those numbers are doing in their own native language, not in your modern calendar language. You walk with the tablet in your mind like it is a lantern lighting up the first kings in that long mythic register. Alulim is there, and then Alangar and others, whose names drift through the tradition like silhouettes at the edge of firelight. The list assigns them reigns that stretch into tens of thousands of years, and it does so with a calmness that is almost funny. It is as if the text is saying, yes, of course, 28,800 years. Why are you acting brand new? One interpretation is that these reigns are symbolic, constructed from culturally meaningful units, designed to convey grandeur and cosmic order rather than literal biography. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it keeps you on solid ground. Now let the numbers feel like objects in your hands. In Mesopotamian tradition, large numbers often cluster around multiples that make sense in base 60. Later scribal explanations talk about units like the sar, and while the exact relationships can vary across contexts, the general idea remains: numbers are built from patterned blocks. A careful reading might suggest that the King List is using those blocks like a composer uses chords, not to measure time precisely, but to create a feeling. The evidence we do have points to scribal culture, enjoying structured numerology, especially when linking kingship to the divine order of the world. Historians still argue whether the King List's giant reign lengths are purely symbolic numerology, a stylized way of compressing multiple rulers into one name, or a tradition that preserves mythic time alongside later history for rhetorical effect. That debate is where you can let your mind relax, because if scholars can argue about it for generations, you are allowed to simply notice how the text behaves. The list is not embarrassed by its own scale. It uses scale like perfume. Too much of it, and it becomes the point. Let me rephrase that more carefully, because it is easy to slip into a modern assumption that ancient writers were either naive or dishonest. A more cautious explanation could be that they were operating in a different genre. They could be blending record ritual and ideology, and the list may not be asking you to treat every line as literal. In ancient contexts, a king's reign length can symbolize stability, divine favor, or the golden age of an era. It is possible that the earliest kings represent a world closer to the gods, where time itself is portrayed as thicker and slower, like honey. You imagine a scribe in a schoolroom showing students how to copy the list. The student's hand trembles slightly as they press the stylus, and the teacher taps the edge of the tablet with a look that says no. That wedge is crooked. Fix it. The student sighs. This is your second light joke tonight, because even in ancient Mesopotamia, there is always one kid who tries to write faster and ends up inventing a new character, and the teacher is like, "Congratulations, you have created chaos." Go sit in the corner and think about order. Archaeology suggests that scribal education involved copying standard texts, lists, and compositions. And the evidence we do have points to King List material being part of the textual world scribes preserved. One interpretation is that the King List is not only about the past, it is also about training the future, training people to think of history as a sequence with a clear spine. And what if the numbers are part of that training, teaching awe as much as teaching writing? Because when you copy a king who reigns for 36,000 years, you are not just practicing math, you are practicing reverence. Now the totals. You hear that headline number in your mind like a slow drum, 241,200 years. It feels like someone tossed a mountain onto a table. Most historians agree that this scale does not match human biology, and archaeology suggests ordinary lifespans and ordinary generational change in the ancient world. So what could such a total be doing? One interpretation is that the total itself is a symbolic statement, an intentional vastness that frames the earliest age of kingship as a distant, mythic epic. A careful reading might suggest it creates contrast, because later reigns shorten, and the world begins to feel more like human time. It's possible the list is shaping your sense of decline from an age of enormous reigns to an age of shorter, more fragile rule. That kind of decline story shows up in many cultures. The idea that the past was bigger, stronger, closer to perfection, and the present is smaller and messier. If you are trying to persuade people that order is precious, implying that time used to be grand and is now more limited, is a very effective emotional tool. Now we move into the mist gently and label it softly. A fringe idea proposes that the vast reign lengths are literal because the earliest rulers were not fully human, sometimes linked to modern Anunnaki theories. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream readings treat these numbers as symbolic or literary. To be clear, this is debated. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it offers a cinematic mood. What if the story is pointing at something else, like the memory of a ruling class that felt distant and untouchable, later mythologized into near immortality? Or what if in the mind of later scribes, the earliest era needed to feel impossibly long so that kingship itself looked ancient enough to be unquestionable? A popular rumor claims that the numbers hide coded astronomy or planetary cycles, that the list is a disguised sky chart rather than a king roster. The evidence is thin, and scholars continue to debate how much astronomical meaning is safely read into these specific totals. A more cautious explanation could be that Mesopotamian cultures did care deeply about the sky, and they did connect cosmic order with earthly authority, but connecting every large number to a secret code risks turning interpretation into certainty. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep it in the mist where it belongs. Back on solid ground, you return to the tactile reality of counting. You picture storehouses. You picture sacks of barley. You picture scribes tallying receipts and rations. The same culture that can invent huge symbolic reigns is also the culture that can count sheep with ruthless precision. That contrast matters. It suggests that the scribes were capable of practical math, which means the giant numbers are probably not simple mistakes. One interpretation is that the huge reigns are deliberate literary choices, a style of saying this is the beginning, this is sacred history, this is the time when the world was different. You notice the reed stylus again and how it forces slowness. You cannot rush wedges into clay without making a mess. You have to press, lift, rotate, press again. That physical rhythm might be part of why the numbers feel calm. The list is not shouted, it is pressed into being. And what if that is the real legacy of 241,200 years? Not that anyone lived that long, but that a civilization learned how to make time feel tangible, to trap it in clay, to hand it to the future like a small, heavy stone. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that the King List exists and uses patterned numbers. The interpretation is that those numbers serve ideology and cosmic order. The imagined part is the quiet feeling of standing beside a scribe as they write eternity into the smallest wedges. The tablet stays warm in your mind as if your palm has been resting on it for a long time, and the wedges look like tiny footprints left by a careful bird. Tap, press, lift. The reed stylus keeps that soft callback rhythm, and the city around you feels quieter now, not because it is empty, but because the story has pulled you closer to the idea at the center of it all: kingship. In the King List, kingship is not introduced as a human invention, like a clever tool or a practical compromise. It arrives, it descends, it moves. Most historians agree that this language reflects Mesopotamian religious ideology, where authority is intertwined with the gods, temple institutions, and cosmic order. Archaeology suggests that temples and palaces became organizing forces in cities, and the evidence we do have points to rulers presenting themselves as chosen, favored, and sanctioned, not merely elected by a committee of tired farmers. One interpretation is that when the list says kingship comes from heaven, it is performing legitimacy. It is telling you that power is not negotiable because it is backed by the structure of the universe. That is a careful way to read it without turning it into a sci-fi headline. A more cautious explanation could be that heaven, in this context, is a symbolic source of authority, not a physical location you can visit with luggage. Still, the phrase works even now because it gives power a glow. It makes rulership feel like gravity, like weather, like something you are supposed to accept. And what if that is why the list is so soothing at bedtime? Because it takes a chaotic human world and says, relax, there is an order. Even if the order is partly invented, the comfort is real. You walk through a temple corridor where the air is cooler and the walls hold the scent of smoke and clay. There are small offerings, perhaps bread or fruit, placed with quiet seriousness. A priest murmurs. A worker sweeps. Somewhere, someone argues about grain rations because even sacred places have budgets. This is your first light joke for the section, because if you have ever been around a modern institution, you know that every temple eventually becomes a paperwork factory. The gods might be eternal, but the inventory list is due at sunset. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian kingship involves both religious and administrative roles. The ruler is tied to the city's patron deity and to the task of maintaining order, including canals, agriculture, and justice. The evidence we do have points to rulers presenting themselves as shepherds of the people, a metaphor that sounds gentle until you remember that shepherds also decide where the flock goes. One interpretation is that calling yourself a shepherd makes control sound like care. It is possible that the King List amplifies this by framing kingship as something bestowed, not seized. Historians still argue whether the King List primarily serves as a theological statement about divine order, a political tool designed to legitimize specific dynasties, or a complex blend of both, shaped by scribal tradition. That debate is important because it changes how you imagine the text being used. Picture a scribe in a royal court, tasked with copying a version of the list that supports the current ruling city. Picture a temple school, where students memorize sequences of kings as if they are learning the proper order of the world. Archaeology suggests that texts circulated and were copied, and the evidence we do have points to multiple versions of the King List that differ in details. That alone suggests the list is not a single frozen artifact. It is a living tradition, edited and curated. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Saying a text is curated does not mean it is fake. It means it is purposeful. A careful reading might suggest that the King List chooses certain lines of kingship and organizes them to present continuity. It's possible it smooths out overlaps, rival claims, and the messy reality that multiple cities could have leaders at the same time. If you have ever looked at a family tree that ignores the awkward cousin, you understand the vibe. This is your second light joke, because history is often a family reunion where someone says, "We do not talk about that branch." Now, the list's central trick is not only that kingship comes from heaven, it is that kingship moves from city to city like a torch. Eridu has it, then another city, then another. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian history involves shifting centers of power among city-states and later kingdoms. Archaeology suggests that political dominance could move with trade routes, military strength alliances, and the control of irrigation. The evidence we do have points to cycles of rise and decline, with cities like Kish-Uruk-Ur and others becoming prominent at different times. One interpretation is that the King List turns this messy competition into a clean relay race. The baton of kingship is passed with dignity, and the story pretends there is only one legitimate holder at a time. That is a neat narrative, and it is possible that neatness is part of the text's purpose. It makes the political world feel stable, even when it is not. And what if the list is less about telling you what happened and more about telling you what should be believed about authority? Now we step gently into the mist, because this is where modern imagination loves to camp out. A fringe idea proposes that kingship from heaven is literal, and that it hints at non-human beings, bringing rulership knowledge and long lifespans sometimes linked to the Anunnaki in modern theory. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream scholarship treats the language as religious symbolism. To be clear, this is debated. The evidence we do have does not confirm visitors. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic lens. What if the story is pointing at something else, like the shock of civilization itself? The sudden appearance of institutions so powerful they felt beyond human scale. A popular rumor claims that early kings were priest kings with secret knowledge that temples functioned like mysterious research centers, and that the line between God and ruler was intentionally blurred. Again, the evidence is thin for those modern flourishes, but archaeology suggests that temples were indeed centers of learning, storage, and administration. A more cautious explanation could be that priestly authority and royal authority overlapped in complicated ways, creating a social structure that later generations described in mythic terms. Back on solid ground, you notice how the idea of kingship descending is paired with the idea of order. In Mesopotamian thought, kingship often connects to maintaining justice and correct ritual keeping, canals flowing, keeping boundaries respected, keeping the city in harmony with the divine. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where chaos is always near, and order is always work. One interpretation is that by placing kingship in heaven's hands, the text makes order feel like the natural state of the universe, even though everyone knows order is actually a daily struggle involving mud labor and people arguing. You can almost hear those arguments in a courtyard. Two farmers complain about water rights. A canal worker says the sluice gate needs repair. A clerk demands a ration tally. A priest insists the ritual timing must be correct. And somewhere above it all, a ruler listens, because listening is part of appearing wise. This is your third light joke, because the hardest part of being king might be pretending you are not just a referee in a never-ending group chat. And as you keep walking through the temple shadows, you hold the idea gently. The King List is making kingship feel ancient, transferable, and sacred. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that kingship was framed through divine ideology. The interpretation is that the list uses that framing to legitimize political order. The imagined part is the quiet sense of a torch being passed from city to city under a night sky that watches without comment. The torch of kingship keeps moving in your mind, and you can almost see it as a small flame, sheltered by two hands, walking carefully through a windy street so it does not go out. The air is cooler now. The city smells less like river mud and more like smoke wool and the faint sharpness of tannins from leather work. Somewhere a door creaks. Somewhere a pot simmers. Somewhere a tired person sighs like they have been sighing for 4,000 years and would like to clock out. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamia was not one unified state for most of its early history, but a landscape of city-states with shifting alliances and rivalries. Archaeology suggests that power centers changed over time, as trade routes, irrigation networks, and military pressures altered the balance. The evidence we do have points to cycles of dominance, where one city could rise, gather influence, and then fade, while another takes the lead. This is not a straight line. It is more like a stubborn game of musical chairs, except the chairs are temples and the music is politics. The King List, though, presents a cleaner picture. Kingship goes here, then here, then here, as if the universe has a single filing cabinet, and it is very organized. One interpretation is that the list imposes order on a messy reality. It is possible it turns overlapping local rulers into a tidy sequence because tidy sequences are easier to teach, easier to recite, and easier to use as a legitimacy tool. A careful reading might suggest that the list is less interested in capturing every detail and more interested in presenting a narrative of rightful succession. You walk through a road between cities in your imagination, the kind of road that is not paved, just compacted by feet, hooves, and carts that squeal like they are personally offended by friction. A caravan passes donkeys loaded with baskets of grain or wool. A merchant calls out greetings in a tone that says, "I am friendly, but also I am watching my inventory." Most historians agree that trade-connected Mesopotamian cities and archaeology suggests exchange networks for goods like metals, stone timber, and textiles. The evidence we do have points to cities depending on both local agriculture and long-distance connections, because the southern plains lack certain raw materials. In other words, you can build a city out of mud brick, but you cannot build a good life out of mud alone. Now, the list's city-to-city movement becomes easier to feel. Power follows resources. Power follows water. Power follows who controls labor and who can protect canals and fields. One interpretation is that the King List reflects real shifts in dominance, but simplifies them. It's possible that when it says kingship moved, it is referencing the idea that one city's rulers became preeminent in a wider political world, recognized or at least feared by neighbors. Historians still argue whether the King List's neat sequence of kingship transfers represents a genuine memory of regional hegemony passing between cities, a retroactive attempt to legitimize later rulers by linking them to an orderly past, or a scribal ideal that ignores the messy overlap of real-world politics. That argument sits right at the heart of the list's charm. It is both history-flavored and story-shaped. You arrive at a new city in your imagination, and it feels different from Eridu. Not because the buildings are wildly different, but because the mood is different. The streets are busier, the market louder, the gate more guarded. A group of workers repairs a canal edge with baskets of mud, slapping it into place like they are patching a leaking boat. A clerk watches tablet in hand because nothing says trust like being observed by someone with accounting skills. This is your first light joke for the section. In every era, there is always someone who thinks supervision is a personality trait. Most historians agree that irrigation maintenance required organized labor, and archaeology suggests that coordination around water management was central to the functioning of cities. The evidence we do have points to water as both lifeline and conflict source, because whoever controls the canals can make fields flourish or fail. One interpretation is that kingship movement can be read through this lens. A city that gains control of water networks and labor can project power. Now, the King List treats these transfers as if the universe itself approves. Kingship is like a badge, and the badge is handed over in an orderly way. But in real city-state life, the badge might be taken, bargained for, or claimed through marriage alliance or conquest. Let me rephrase that more carefully so we keep our language safe. The evidence we do have shows competition and conflict existed, but we are not going to dwell on graphic violence. We can say gently that city-states competed and power shifted, and rulers used ideology and administration to support their claims. So, you picture a council of elders, a priestly delegation, and a ruler all negotiating the same question: who gets to say they are in charge? A careful reading might suggest that the King List answers that question by pretending there is only one correct sequence. It is possible that the list is a kind of compromised text, a way to present multiple city traditions as one continuous chain, so that the concept of kingship looks uninterrupted, even when politics were turbulent. Now we step into the mist again lightly. A fringe idea proposes that the city-to-city transfers are traces of an older pattern, perhaps a hidden structure of rule imposed from above, with kingship being a literal institution controlled by non-human overseers. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream readings treat the transfers as political and ideological storytelling. To be clear, this is debated. There is no solid evidence confirming overseers, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still serve as a cinematic what if the list is pointing at something else, like an ancient sense that power was not only human but cosmic, and that cities were stations in a sacred network. A popular rumor claims that certain cities were chosen because of their alignment with the stars, or sacred geography, and that kingship moved according to celestial timing. The evidence is thin, but archaeology suggests that Mesopotamians did observe the sky carefully, and they did connect cosmic order with earthly order. A more cautious explanation could be that astronomical symbolism influenced how people spoke about kingship without requiring literal star-directed transfers. Back on solid ground, you notice the human side again. A runner arrives at a gate with a message tablet. A guard reads it slowly, as if reading is an act of authority. A merchant whispers news. A family worries about taxes. A worker hopes the canal holds. In this world, kingship is not a romantic concept. It is the force that decides whether your irrigation ditch gets repaired. One interpretation is that the King List's neat handoffs are meant to reassure the audience that even when cities change, the institution of kingship endures. It's possible the list is offering continuity as comfort. This is your second light joke, because the list is basically saying, do not worry, leadership is always under control, and every listener in every era quietly replies, sure, yes, absolutely. That is what leadership is known for, calm control. And yet you can see why people would want to believe it. When water is unpredictable and politics shift, a story that says kingship moves in an orderly chain feels like a blanket. It makes the world feel less random. Most historians agree that ideological texts often serve this purpose, and the evidence we do have points to rulers and institutions using narratives to stabilize legitimacy. So you keep walking, carrying the image of that sheltered flame from city to city. The reed stylus taps somewhere in the background, continuing its quiet pulse. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that city-states rose and fell. The interpretation is that the King List organizes these shifts into a single, orderly succession. The imagined part is the night road between cities where kingship moves like a torch, and you, sleepy traveler, follow its glow. The road dust clings to your ankles like a polite reminder that travel is work, even in imagination. You pass a canal that reflects the stars in broken pieces, as if the sky has been chopped into little rectangles and placed on the water for decoration. The city behind you fades into the night, and ahead you can see a low glow that suggests another settlement, another temple platform, another cluster of roofs pressed close together like people sharing warmth. And through all of it, you keep hearing that small sound, tap, press, lift, tap, press, lift. Not loud, not urgent, just persistent. Most historians agree that scribes and scribal schools were central to Mesopotamian culture because writing becomes the nervous system of the city. Archaeology suggests that training in cuneiform involved copying lists, proverbs, legal formulas, and literary compositions. The evidence we do have points to writing being used for practical administration, but also for preserving tradition, shaping ideology, and teaching young scribes what the world is supposed to look like on paper. Now you step into a scribal school. In your mind, a simple room with a swept floor, a low bench, and a stack of damp clay tablets waiting like blank faces. The air smells of wet earth and reeds. A teacher sits with the confidence of someone who knows every wedge mark you are about to get wrong. Students sit in a line, their hands dusty, their shoulders tense, their eyes heavy. This is your first light joke for the section because you can already feel the ancient version of "do we really have homework tonight?" and the teacher's ancient version of "yes, you have homework until the sun dies." A student presses a stylus into clay and makes a wedge that leans too far. The teacher sighs, points, and the student smooths the clay and tries again. Tap, press, lift. This physical rhythm forces attention. You cannot scroll past a mistake. You cannot delete with a backspace. You have to smooth the surface and start the line again, which means even boredom becomes discipline. One interpretation is that the King List survives not because it was carved into stone and defended by guards, but because it was useful to teach and to copy. It's possible that certain texts stayed alive because they worked as training tools, as cultural anchors, as political frameworks. The evidence we do have points to multiple copies of the King List tradition, which suggests it circulated and mattered, at least to the people with the power to preserve clay. Historians still argue whether the King List was primarily composed for political legitimation in royal courts, for theological framing in temple contexts, or for educational use in scribal schools as a structured narrative of kingship. That debate is not just academic, it changes the mood. If the list is a court document, you imagine it being read with pride. If it is a school text, you imagine it being copied with boredom and inkless determination. If it is a temple-framed composition, you imagine it being recited with ritual seriousness. A careful reading might suggest it can play all those roles at different times because texts migrate through institutions the way kingship migrates through cities. You watch a student copy a line that says "kingship descended," then a line that lists a king's name, then a line that gives a reign length that makes the student pause. Because even ancient kids know when a number is doing something dramatic. The teacher does not explain it as a mistake. The teacher treats it as normal. That might support the idea that the number is symbolic within the tradition, an intentional feature rather than an error. It is suggestive, not conclusive, but it is a sensible way to interpret how confidently the text presents itself. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian scribes cared deeply about order classification and lists. You can see it in lexical lists of professions, objects, animals, and signs. Archaeology suggests that this list culture is part of how cities manage complexity. The evidence we do have points to listing being a mental habit. The world becomes manageable when you can name and order it. One interpretation is that the Sumerian King List is a list shaped into a story. It takes the list impulse and adds a spine. Kingship moves, cities rise, floods reset, and authority flows. It's possible that the list is a bridge between record-keeping and mythology, a way to make power feel as ordered as grain rations. Now you notice something quietly powerful. A list is selective by nature. It has edges. What it does not include becomes invisible. A careful reading might suggest that the King List omits rival rulers, parallel authorities, and complicated overlaps in order to produce one clean line of succession. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but the very format invites it. Because a list is the perfect tool for saying this is the official version. This is your second light joke. Because if you have ever seen a modern resume, you already know the list format. It is not lying, it is just presenting the most flattering sequence of events. Ancient kingship gets the same treatment. You could almost imagine the king list whispering, "Yes, I did take a few liberties, but I look fantastic in bullet points." Archaeology suggests that scribes worked for temples and palaces, and the evidence we do have points to writing being connected to power. If you can control the archive, you can control memory. One interpretation is that scribal schools do not merely teach writing, they teach worldview. They train people to accept certain narratives as normal. It's possible that copying the king list trains you to accept the idea that kingship is a single institution with a single legitimate chain. Now we step into the mist softly. A fringe idea proposes that scribes were not only administrators, but keepers of secret knowledge encoding hidden messages in numbers and names, and that the king list is a kind of cipher. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream scholarship views scribal practice as practical, religious, and ideological, rather than clandestine code making. To be clear, this is debated. The evidence is thin for intentional hidden messages in the way modern rumor loves to imagine. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic mood. What if the story is pointing at something else, like the fact that literacy itself felt mysterious and powerful, and so later imagination turned scribes into wizards with reed pens? A popular rumor claims that certain reign lengths correspond to celestial cycles, and that scribes encoded astronomy into political texts. Again, the evidence is thin for that specific claim in this context, but archaeology suggests Mesopotamian elites did track the sky and connect it to ritual and authority. A more cautious explanation could be that cosmic symbolism influenced how numbers were chosen without requiring a precise secret code. Back on solid ground, you watch the student's tablet fill with wedges. The clay begins to dry at the edges, and the student licks a finger to smooth a mistake, which is not the glamorous part of history, but it is definitely real life. The teacher nods once approvingly, and the student relaxes for half a second until the next tablet is placed in front of them. Tap, press lift. And what if this is the true engine of legacy? Not an emperor's speech, not a battle, but a tired student copying a list because the curriculum says so. Most historians agree that much of Mesopotamian literature survives through educational copying. The evidence we do have points to continuity through repetition. One interpretation is that the king list's power is partly in its teachability. It's possible it survives because it is structured rhythmic and authoritative, like a chant of order. This is your third light joke, because you can now picture the scribal version of procrastination. A student glances at the door, hoping for a surprise holiday declared by the gods. The gods do not deliver. The teacher does. The stylist goes back to work. So you let the schoolroom fade into night again. You leave with the sound of writing in your ears, the soft fan hum in your room, matching the ancient rhythm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is scribal education and the survival of texts through copying. The interpretation is that the king list is curated and used to shape legitimacy and worldview. The imagined part is the sleepy classroom where kingship and eternity are practiced one wedge at a time. The schoolroom sound fades behind you, but the rhythm stays tap, press, lift, as if it has moved into your own breathing. You step out into the night streets again. The air smells like baked clay, cooling after a long day of sun. A lamp flickers in a doorway and throws a soft rectangle of light onto the ground, and that light feels almost modern, like a porch light you pass on a late walk. Except here, the porch is mud brick, and the neighborhood watch is a sleepy dog and a suspicious rooster. You follow the chain of names forward until one of them suddenly feels familiar, like a face you have seen on posters, in stories, and the cultural background noise of the ancient world. Gilgamesh. Most historians agree that Gilgamesh is a major figure in Mesopotamian literature, and that a later epic tradition preserves stories about him. Archaeology suggests that the city of Uruk was a major early urban center, and the evidence we do have points to kingship and temple institutions developing there in complex ways. Now, the King List does something interesting. It gives you a name that feels legendary, but it frames him in the language of rulership, as if to say, yes, the hero belongs on the official shelf too. One interpretation is that the King List is stitching together two kinds of memory, the administrative memory of kings and the imaginative memory of heroes. It's possible that by including Gilgamesh, the list borrows the glow of epic fame to strengthen the legitimacy of the sequence. And what if instead the inclusion works the other way, grounding the epic in the official record, whispering to you? This hero was not just a story, he was a king. He stood in a real city with real walls and real taxes. Now you walk toward Uruk in your imagination, and the city feels bigger, louder, more confident. The walls rise with a kind of stubborn pride. There are more people in the streets, more noise, more trade. You hear the clatter of carts, the call of vendors, the slap of sandals, the low rumble of animals. Most historians agree that Uruk is associated with early urban growth and important developments in administration and writing. Archaeology suggests that large-scale building temple complexes and organized labor are present in the Uruk period, and the evidence we do have points to cities becoming complex enough to require systems, not just charisma. You approach the massive wall, and even in a sleep-friendly mood, you can feel the statement it makes. This is not a hut village. This is a place declaring permanence. One interpretation is that urban walls symbolize more than defense. They symbolize the boundary between the ordered city and the surrounding chaos. It's possible the wall itself becomes part of legitimacy, because if you can build a wall, you can coordinate labor, and if you can coordinate labor, you can rule. Historians still argue whether Gilgamesh should be treated primarily as a literary figure built from multiple traditions, a memory of a historical ruler later transformed into epic, or a symbolic hero whose kingship in the King List reflects the blending of myth and political narrative. That debate is where your bedtime mind can float, because the evidence we do have does not give a simple answer. A careful reading might suggest that Gilgamesh sits at the intersection of memory and imagination. It is possible that the name preserves a historical core, but the epic layers around it are literary, shaped by centuries of storytelling. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Saying there may be a historical core does not mean we can confidently reconstruct the real person. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The evidence is thin for detailed biography, but the endurance of the name is a clue that the figure mattered deeply. Now imagine how a city would remember a powerful ruler. Not with a perfect documentary film, but with a story that grows with each retelling. A ruler builds walls, so the story says he built walls no one could match. A ruler defeats rivals, so the story says he fought monsters. A ruler struggles with mortality, so the story turns that struggle into a journey. This is your first light joke for the section, because it is basically the ancient version of a fan base exaggerating online. Someone says he was tall, and by the third retelling he is 12 feet tall and can bench press a bull, Most historians agree that epic literature often reflects human concerns through symbolic narrative. The evidence we do have points to the Epic of Gilgamesh, exploring friendship, power, and mortality. One interpretation is that the King List and the Epic are different genres that still share a cultural environment. It's possible they borrow from each other, or that they both draw on shared memories of rulers and cities. Now, the King List's inclusion of Gilgamesh also serves a political function. The list is not neutral. It aligns kings with cities. It creates a chain. A careful reading might suggest that by naming famous figures, it strengthens the authority of the sequence. If your city can claim Gilgamesh, your city's prestige goes up. This is your second light joke, because you can imagine the ancient version of a tourism campaign. Visit Uruk, home of Gilgamesh. See the legendary walls, buy a commemorative clay mug. Please do not chip the ziggurat. Archaeology suggests that prestige and identity were tied to city gods, temples, and founding traditions. The evidence we do have points to cities competing not only in resources, but in reputation. One interpretation is that the King List participates in this competition by creating an official narrative where kingship passes and certain cities shine at certain times. Now we step into the mist gently. A fringe idea proposes that Gilgamesh and other legendary rulers preserve memories of extraordinary beings, possibly linked to modern Anunnaki interpretations, with stories of great strength and long life being treated as literal. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream scholarship treats the epic elements as literary and symbolic. To be clear, this is debated. The evidence we do have does not confirm non-human rulers. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic what if. What if the mythic exaggeration is a way ancient people express the feeling that rulers were far above ordinary life, almost like another category of being? A popular rumor claims that the epic journey motifs hide coded knowledge about ancient technology, lost maps, or secret histories. The evidence is thin for those modern claims. A more cautious explanation could be that people project modern mysteries onto ancient texts because the texts are poetic and incomplete, which creates open space for imagination. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Back on solid ground, you stay with Uruk's walls because walls are real, and cities are real, and the labor to build them is real. You imagine workers carrying bricks, stacking them, smoothing them with wet hands, singing to keep rhythm. You imagine overseers counting rations, scribes recording deliveries, priests blessing the work. Most historians agree that large construction projects required organized labor and administration. Archaeology suggests that early cities coordinated thousands of people for building and irrigation. The evidence we do have points to kingship being tied to the capacity to organize, not just to fight. And what if that is the quiet truth behind the hero stories? Not that a king fought monsters, but that he fought the monster of disorder, the endless daily chaos of a city, and the only weapon was coordination. You stand near the wall and let its shadow fall across you like a cool blanket. The reed stylus sound returns because even walls need records. Tap, press, lift. Gilgamesh's name sits on the tablet like a bridge between story and administration. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Uruk is a major city, and Gilgamesh is a central literary figure. The interpretation is that the King List uses famous names to stitch memory and legitimacy together. The imagined part is you walking under the wall at night, feeling how a name can carry both history and dream. The wall of Uruk fades behind you, but its feeling stays that heavy certainty that a city can build something meant to outlast a human life. You walk into a quieter stretch of night where the wind slips between reed fences and makes a soft shushing sound like the world is asking you to lower your voice. A lamp in the distance flickers, and for a moment, it looks like a star that fell too low and got stuck near the ground. You keep carrying the same small object in your imagination, the clay tablet, the reed stylus, the quiet tap, press, lift that never fully stops. Now the King List begins to feel less like a strange mythic prologue and more like a tool being used with intention. The names and cities stack in sequence, and the sequence itself becomes the message. Most historians agree that dynastic lists and king lists served political and administrative purposes in many ancient societies, and archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian rulers cared deeply about legitimacy, continuity, and divine favor. The evidence we do have points to kings naming their fathers, their gods, their building projects, and their victories, because a ruler's public identity is not only about what they do, but about how they are remembered. A list is memory with a spine. One interpretation is that the Sumerian King List is a deliberate stitching together of legitimacy across multiple city traditions. It's possible the text functions like a bridge connecting rival claims into a single narrative, where kingship appears unified. A careful reading might suggest that this was useful for later rulers who wanted to present themselves as heirs to an ancient and orderly chain rather than as one more contestant in a messy political game. You walk through a courtyard where two men argue quietly, not about philosophy, but about borders. One points toward a canal, the other points toward a field. The argument feels ancient and modern at the same time. This is your first light joke for the section, because if you remove the clay tablet and replace it with a group chat, you have basically recreated modern neighborhood politics. The only difference is that nobody can mute anyone. Most historians agree that land, water rights, and labor obligations were central issues in Mesopotamian city life. Archaeology suggests that irrigation systems created both cooperation and conflict. The evidence we do have points to rulers presenting themselves as guardians of justice and order, partly because order is economically necessary. One interpretation is that king lists help define who has the right to decide, the right to mediate, and the right to collect. It's possible that a list is not only history, but an argument. We are the rightful chain, therefore our decisions are legitimate. Historians still argue whether the King List was primarily composed to support a specific dynasty's political claims to present a theological vision of orderly kingship across time, or to serve as a scribal synthesis that reconciled competing regional traditions. That debate is key, and it shows up in the way the list behaves. It often elevates certain lines of kingship while compressing or omitting others. A careful reading might suggest that the list is not trying to give every ruler equal attention. It is selecting, shaping, prioritizing. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Selection does not automatically equal deceit. It can be a normal feature of tradition. But it does mean the list is not a neutral mirror. It is a crafted lens. You picture scribes in a court copying the list under the gaze of officials who care very much about the order of names. The scribe presses wedges, but the real pressure is social. Write the sequence correctly, preserve the right line, reinforce the story. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. This is your second light joke because it is the ancient version of corporate branding. The list is the company history page on the website. It highlights the successes, smooths the awkward transitions, and politely ignores the messy merger nobody likes to talk about. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian states used inscriptions and texts to project power, And the evidence we do have points to rulers boasting of temple building, canal digging, and divine favor. One interpretation is that the king list is part of this projection, except instead of boasting about one king, it boasts about kingship itself. It's possible it tells you our world has an ancient order. Our rulers belong to it, and therefore you should accept the structure. Now you feel the text tightening its grip on time. The early mythic reigns stretch into enormous spans. Then the flood resets the register, and later kings begin to look more plausible, more human. One interpretation is that this shift is intentional, creating a narrative arc from a sacred age into a historical age. It's possible the king list is telling you our present rulers inherit both the grandeur of myth and the practicality of history. That is a powerful combination. Myth gives awe. History gives credibility. Now we step into the mist softly. A fringe idea proposes that the king list is not only political, but also a record of a real ancient hierarchy imposed by non-human beings, with dynasties reflecting changing administrations of those beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream scholarship treats the list as a human product of scribal culture and political ideology. To be clear, this is debated. The evidence we do have does not confirm non-human administrations. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic what if. Ancient people experienced shifts in authority so dramatic that later tradition described them as cosmic transfers rather than human politics. A popular rumor claims that the list hides suppressed dynasties, erased rivals, or secret lines of kings that were removed for political reasons. The evidence is thin for specific secret lines, but archaeology suggests that political memory can be selective, and that different cities maintained different traditions. A more cautious explanation could be that multiple versions and local narratives existed, and the king list represents one effort to harmonize them into a single storyline. That harmonizing can feel like erasure to modern eyes, but it can also be understood as synthesis. Back on solid ground, you return to the daily mechanics of legitimacy. A ruler needs taxes, labor, and compliance. A temple needs offerings and order. A city needs canals, cleared walls, maintained, disputes settled. In this context, a list that says kingship belongs to a particular chain is not just poetry, it is social infrastructure. One interpretation is that the king list functions like an invisible wall around authority. It's possible that the list helps define who counts as a rightful ruler and who is a mere local strongman. You imagine a festival day where officials read aloud names of past rulers, not to entertain, but to anchor the present. People listen because listening is safer than questioning. The wind carries the words across the crowd, and the names feel like stones dropped into water, each one making ripples of memory. And what if the real magic of the king list is not in the enormous years, but in the way it makes authority feel older than any individual, older than any argument? This is your third light joke, because if you think about it, the list is basically saying, do not argue with your landlord. His paperwork goes back to the dawn of time. You let that thought soften into the night air. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that ancient rulers used texts to legitimize power and preserve memory. The interpretation is that the king list stitches and smooths political reality into an orderly chain. The imagined part is the crowd under lamplight hearing names like a chant, feeling history settle over them like warm dust. The chant of names fades into the night like a song you half remember, and what stays is the weight of the numbers, that huge total that keeps hovering at the edge of your thoughts like a moon that feels too close. 241,200 years. It is the kind of figure that makes your modern brain try to sit upright and ask for a calculator, and your sleepy brain immediately says, no, we are not doing math at bedtime, go lay down. So you let the number become a landscape instead of an equation. You imagine it as a long desert road of time stretching so far, you cannot see the end, with small lamps placed along it at intervals, each lamp a rain, each rain a symbol. The air is cool now. A faint breeze moves across the plain, and you can hear the reed beds whispering again. Most historians agree that the extreme lifespans and reign lengths in the earliest portion of the Sumerian King List do not reflect literal human years. Archaeology suggests ordinary human biology and ordinary generational turnover in ancient Mesopotamia, and the evidence we do have points to the earliest portion of the list, operating in a mythic register. One interpretation is that the giant totals serve as an intentional framing device, marking a distant sacred past and creating a sense of cosmic depth for kingship itself. Now let's keep our language careful. This might support the idea that the number is symbolic rather than factual, but it is suggestive, not conclusive, regarding exactly what symbolic system is being used. Scholars continue to debate how these totals were constructed, whether they reflect patterned numerology, scribal conventions, or a blending of different traditions. If the evidence is thin, we will say so, and here the evidence is thin for one clean explanation that satisfies every detail. Historians still argue whether the great total of 241,200 years is best understood as deliberate sexagesimal numerology, a theological statement about a primordial age, a scribal aggregation of traditional reign figures, or a later editorial choice designed to magnify the antiquity of kingship. That debate is your soft pillow tonight. It allows you to look at the number without demanding it behave like a modern timestamp. Now think about how numbers work emotionally. If someone tells you they waited a long time, you feel sympathy. If someone tells you they waited forever, you feel drama. Ancient texts do the same thing. One interpretation is that 241,200 years is a way of saying kingship is unimaginably old, older than your arguments, older than your doubts, older than the memory of any living person. It's possible that the number is not there to be measured, but to be felt. You walk through a quiet temple courtyard again. The stones, or rather the packed earth, still holds the day's warmth. A lamp burns low. A priest, or maybe just a sleepy attendant, adjusts the wick and watches the flame steady. This is your first light joke for the section, because even in a text about cosmic time, somebody still has to do the boring job of lamp maintenance. Eternity is impressive, but it still needs refueling. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religious life involved ritual timing offerings and the maintenance of temple spaces. Archaeology suggests temples were also economic centers, and the evidence we do have points to the deep connection between cosmic order and earthly administration. One interpretation is that massive numbers fit comfortably in this worldview because they reinforce the idea of a structured universe. The bigger the number, the more it signals that the world is governed by patterns beyond everyday life. Now you remember the base 60 habit again, because it keeps showing up like a familiar melody. A careful reading might suggest that these totals are built from culturally resonant units. It's possible that the earliest reigns are shaped to fit neat numerical patterns, the way a story's verses fit a rhythm. A more cautious explanation could be that scribes inherited rain figures from older tradition and summed them in ways that made sense within their number system, producing totals that feel monumental. At the same time, there is another subtle possibility. Sometimes inflated time spans are used to create distance between the present and the sacred past. If the first kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, then they belong to a world that feels fundamentally different. One interpretation is that this difference strengthens the authority of later kings by connecting them to a sacred origin while still allowing them to be human. It's possible that the list is balancing two needs, mythic grandeur and practical credibility. This is your second light joke, because it is basically the ancient version of someone saying, "My grandfather walked to school uphill both ways for 1,000 years." The point is not the literal geography. The point is respect. Now we step into the mist, gently, because this is where modern theory loves to attach itself to large numbers. A fringe idea proposes that the 241,200 years represent literal years, because the earliest rulers were long-lived beings, sometimes linked in modern imagination to the Anunnaki. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream scholarship treats the numbers as symbolic or literary. To be clear, this is debated. The evidence we do have does not confirm literal reigns of that length. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an atmospheric what if. What if the list preserves the feeling that the earliest rulers were beyond ordinary human scale, whether through myth, ideology, or the awe of early state formation? A popular rumor claims that the total encodes an astronomical cycle, like a grand calendar of planetary motion or precessional timing. The evidence is thin for a precise decoding that everyone agrees on. A more cautious explanation could be that Mesopotamians cared deeply about the sky and used cosmic symbolism in their thinking, but reading every large number as a secret sky code risks turning interpretation into certainty. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep it on the misty side. Back on solid ground, you return to the emotional function. The number 241,200 years makes kingship feel older than any one city, older than any one dynasty, older than any one flood or migration. It turns the institution into something like a mountain. And what if that is the quiet purpose? A list that makes authority feel mountain old is a list that discourages rebellion, not with threats, but with scale. You are small. Kingship is ancient. Please do not disturb the cosmic furniture. You walk through a market lane where a vendor is counting out measures of grain. The vendor's numbers are small, precise, and practical. 1 measure 2 measures 3. The contrast is striking. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian administration required careful measurement and record-keeping, and the evidence we do have points to a culture that could be exact when it needed to be. One interpretation is that the giant rain totals are not a result of mathematical ignorance, but of purposeful literary or ideological choice. It's possible they are meant to operate in a different emotional register than the marketplace numbers. This is your third light joke because the vendor would absolutely roll their eyes at 241,200 years and say, "Great, but do you have exact change?" You let that image settle into something calm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that the King List uses enormous rain figures and totals not plausible as literal years. The interpretation is that these figures serve symbolic, ideological, and narrative functions, possibly tied to sexagesimal patterning and sacred time. The imagined part is you walking under lamplight, letting the number become a horizon rather than a homework problem. The horizon of 241,200 years recedes into the background like distant hills in a dream, and the night grows more intimate again. You find yourself under a sky so wide it almost feels like an ocean turned upside down. Stars hang there steady and quiet, and for a moment you can imagine ancient eyes looking up at the same pattern, not with telescopes, but with patience. The air is cool enough to make you pull your cloak a little tighter. Somewhere nearby, a small fire crackles, and someone has set a pot over it that smells faintly like barley soup. Now gently we step into a word that always draws attention like a lamp being turned up slightly. Anunnaki. Most historians agree that the Anunnaki are deities in Mesopotamian religion, part of the mythic and divine vocabulary of Sumerian and Akkadian tradition. Archaeology suggests that gods, temples, rituals, and divine hierarchies were woven into daily life, and the evidence we do have points to divine assemblies, underworld themes, and the idea that cosmic order is managed by powerful supernatural figures. In other words, the Anunnaki belong to the religious landscape, the way thunder belongs to the sky in a story. One interpretation is that when modern people connect the Sumerian King List to the Anunnaki, they are blending two streams, the list's gigantic reigns and the mythic idea of powerful beings who stand above humans. It's possible that this blend feels natural because both the list and the myths speak in the language of scale. Kingship descends, time stretches. The divine world feels close enough to touch, but always just out of reach. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The King List itself is a king list, not a mythological poem, and the evidence we do have does not show it explicitly saying these kings are Anunnaki. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and in mainstream scholarship, it is not treated as a direct claim. Still, the overlap in atmosphere invites interpretation, and people love an atmosphere. You sit near the fire in your imagination and watch the sparks rise and fade. A priest, or maybe a storyteller, speaks in a low voice about gods and order. A child listens with wide eyes. A worker listens with tired eyes. Everyone listens because stories are a kind of shared shelter. Most historians agree that myth was not separate from life in Mesopotamia, and archaeology suggests that temples were centers of community, economy, and ideology. The evidence we do have points to gods being invoked in treaties, oaths, kingship claims, and everyday prayers. Historians still argue whether references to divine beings in Mesopotamian texts should be read primarily as religious metaphor and ritual reality, as political ideology used to reinforce authority, or as layered traditions that change meaning across time and place. That debate matters because it shapes how you treat the Anunnaki in this story. On solid ground, they are gods, part of a cosmology invoked to explain order. On the misty edge, modern readers sometimes treat them as something else. Now, one mainstream safe anchor is this: Mesopotamian kings often frame their authority as divinely supported. The evidence we do have points to rulers claiming favor from specific gods, building temples, offering sacrifices, and presenting themselves as chosen. One interpretation is that divine language is a political tool as much as a spiritual truth. It's possible that the King List's kingship from heaven fits this wider habit of grounding authority in the divine realm. You look up at the stars again. Ancient people did not have modern scientific models, but they had careful observation. They tracked cycles, seasons, and celestial events with impressive discipline. Archaeology suggests that astronomy and astrology developed over time in Mesopotamia, and the evidence we do have points to the sky being used for calendars and omens. One interpretation is that cosmic thinking made it natural to connect kingship time and divine beings. It's possible the King List's massive time spans echo a worldview where the cosmos operates on scales that dwarf human life. This is your first light joke for the section. Your modern brain wants to tell the ancient priest, yes, the cosmos is huge, but can we please keep the numbers under 5 digits, because some of us are trying to sleep. The priest does not care. The cosmos does not care. The stars continue their slow performance. Now we step into the mist, carefully labeled, because this is the part where modern theory often walks in wearing confident boots. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were not mythic gods, but literal non-human visitors who ruled in deep antiquity, and that the King List's enormous reigns preserve that memory. This theory isn't widely accepted. To be clear, this is debated, and the evidence we do have does not confirm literal extraterrestrial rulers. Mainstream scholarship treats the Anunnaki as deities within a religious system, and the giant reigns as symbolic or literary. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it functions as a cinematic what if the story is pointing at something else, like a metaphor for a ruling class so powerful and remote that later tradition described them as God. A popular rumor claims that ancient texts contain coded references to advanced technology, genetic manipulation, or off-world mining tied to the Anunnaki. The evidence is thin for these claims, and we will say so gently. A more cautious explanation could be that mythic language about creation labor and divine power is often interpreted too literally by modern readers who want a science narrative inside a religious poem. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and we should not replace one kind of story with another and call it fact. Back on solid ground, you return to the human reasons gods matter. In a world where floods can reset lives and city politics can shift overnight, divine order offers a kind of stability. One interpretation is that gods and divine assemblies help communities explain uncertainty and justify rules. It's possible that the King List's sacred framing is part of that same psychological and social architecture. The list is not just telling you who ruled, it is telling you that rulership belongs to an ordered universe. You watch the fire settle into coals. A pot simmers. Someone stirs it with a wooden spoon and looks up at the sky as if asking it a question. The stars do not answer in words, but they answer in repetition. Night after night, the same patterns return. This is your second light joke because the stars are basically the original subscription service. Same content every night, no ads, just a little seasonal variation. Ancient people loved that reliability, so did their calendars. Now you hold the phrase Anunnaki again, and you let it sit where it belongs. Documented, the Anunnaki are deities in Mesopotamian religion. Interpreted divine language supports kingship legitimacy and cosmic order. Imagined, what if the distance between gods and kings is the distance between myth and memory, and the list is walking that line on purpose? You stand up from the fire and brush dust from your cloak. The reed stylus rhythm returns like a heartbeat in the dark. Tap, press, lift. You keep moving not toward a conclusion, but toward a better feeling for the balance between solid ground and mist. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And tonight, the Anunnaki remain in the sky of the story, luminous, influential, and unconfirmed as anything more than the gods they are in the texts. You leave the fire behind, but its warmth clings to you like a soft aftertaste. The night air is cooler now, and the sky feels closer, as if the stars have leaned in to listen. A faint wind crosses the plain and makes the reeds hiss, and for a moment, it sounds like someone whispering secrets just beyond your hearing. Your eyes drift upward again, because in Mesopotamia, the sky is not just scenery, it is a calendar, a warning system, and a canvas for meaning. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian scholars, especially in later periods, developed sophisticated practices of observing the heavens, tracking cycles, and interpreting celestial phenomena. Archaeology suggests that timekeeping calendars and ritual timing were central to temple life, and the evidence we do have points to the sky being used to organize agricultural seasons, festivals, and royal legitimacy. One interpretation is that when a culture lives with unpredictable rivers and competitive politics, the sky becomes a comforting clock, a stable pattern above a shifting world. Now, the King List is still on your mind, but tonight it shares the stage with the heavens. A careful reading might suggest that some of the list's numerical habits feel at home in a culture that loves cycles and structured counting. It's possible that the list's huge reigns and totals are not only political theater, but also a way of aligning human authority with cosmic scale. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You step into a temple courtyard, where a priestly observer is watching the night. They are not using modern instruments, just trained eyes, a disciplined memory, and maybe a simple measuring tool or a reference point on a wall. A lamp burns low beside them, because even sky watching needs a little light to mark notes. The observer murmurs a name for a star or a constellation, then scratches a mark onto a tablet. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. The reed stylus is still here, because it always is. Historians still argue whether early Mesopotamian astronomical practice was primarily pragmatic calendar making, primarily omen interpretation, tied to political decisions, or a blend of both shaped by temple institutions and royal needs. That debate matters because it changes the mood of sky knowledge. If it is practical, it is about planting and harvesting. If it is omen-focused, it is about anxiety and authority. A careful reading might suggest it is both, because people can be practical and superstitious at the same time, without seeing any contradiction. That is a timeless human skill. This is your first light joke for the section. You modern listener might think, wow, ancient astronomy, how noble. Then you realize half of it is basically, if Mars looks weird, the king should maybe not pick a fight this week. It is cosmic weather forecasting with political consequences. Most historians agree that omen traditions were important in Mesopotamia, especially in later cuneiform scholarship, and the evidence we do have points to elites taking signs seriously. One interpretation is that linking kingship to the sky strengthens authority. It's possible that if the heavens seem to approve of your reign feels less arguable. A more cautious explanation could be that this is social psychology wrapped in ritual language. Now we step gently into the mist because this is where modern rumor loves to attach itself to stars. A popular rumor claims that ancient Mesopotamian sky knowledge was far beyond what we expect that it included: hidden maps, advanced calculations, or coded references to planetary visitors. The evidence is thin for those claims, and we will say so plainly. Mainstream scholarship recognizes impressive observational practice and later mathematical astronomy, but not a confirmed hidden alien syllabus. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumor functions as atmosphere. What if the story is pointing at something else, like the fact that ancient people could be brilliant observers without needing modern technology? A fringe idea, proposes that the King List numbers are actually a coded astronomical calendar, and that 241,200 years is not about human reigns, but about cosmic cycles. This theory isn't widely accepted, and scholars continue to debate how far numerological readings can be taken. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The presence of patterned numbers might support the idea that symbolism is involved, but it is suggestive, not conclusive, that a precise astronomical code is hidden inside the list. It's possible to admire the numerical structure without claiming a secret key that unlocks everything. Back on solid ground, you return to what is broadly accepted. The sky mattered, and counting mattered. A culture that lives by irrigation and festival cycles will naturally develop careful timekeeping. The evidence we do have points to the use of months, seasons, and ritual calendars, and to the base 60 habit-shaping math. One interpretation is that the King List's use of enormous numbers taps into this broader numerical imagination. It's possible that the list is signaling cosmic order, not literal chronology. You walk past a group of people gathered in a small open space. Someone points at a bright star. Someone else shrugs. A child asks if the star is watching them. An adult answers in the calm way adults do when they do not know, by turning the question into a story. Most historians agree that myth and observation often coexisted, and the evidence we do have points to the sky being both measured and mythologized. One interpretation is that this dual relationship makes it easy for later readers to blur lines between religion and science. This is your second light joke, because humans are consistent. We can chart the sky with precision and still ask, but what does it mean for my love life? The ancient version probably involved a priest, a tablet, and a very serious face, which is honestly no different from modern horoscopes, just with better handwriting. Now the King List, again. It sits beside the sky knowledge in your mind like two jars on the same shelf. One jar is political memory. The other is cosmic order. A careful reading might suggest that the list wants you to feel that kingship belongs inside the grand structure of time. It's possible that enormous reigns are part of that emotional architecture, making rulership feel aligned with vast cycles. And what if the numbers are not lying to you, but singing to you using the only language that can match the scale of the sky? Historians still argue whether the modern fascination with Anunnaki and coded star knowledge reflects anything in the ancient sources themselves, or mostly reflects modern desires to find technological narratives inside religious and political texts. That debate is an important safety rail. It reminds you that modern stories can be powerful, but they are not automatically ancient truth. The evidence we do have points to God's rituals and human institutions. Interpretation can explore symbolism. Imagination can enjoy what if. But we do not slide speculation into fact. This is your third light joke, because the sky is huge and mysterious enough already. We do not need to add a secret space parking lot unless we are doing it purely for cinematic mood. So you let the stars remain stars and the list remain a list, and your mind remains gently curious. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamians observed the sky and used it for calendars and omens. The interpretation is that cosmic thinking influenced how authority and numbers were framed. The imagined part is you standing under the same stars, hearing reeds whisper, and feeling that the heavens are not giving you answers, but giving you scale. The stars slowly drift westward, Or at least they seem to, because your body is still, and time is doing its quiet work. The reeds keep hissing. The fan in your room keeps humming. And somewhere in a temple archive or a scribal school, the clay tablets keep stacking up like sleeping bricks, each one holding a slice of someone's version of the past. Now you come to a part of the journey that feels oddly modern, the idea that the story you hold depends on how it is copied, translated, and arranged. The Sumerian King List is not a single flawless original sitting in a glass case with a perfect label. The evidence we do have points to multiple versions and copies made in different times, and archaeology suggests that scribes preserve traditions while also adapting them to their own contexts. That's mainstream safe ground. It means the list is real, but its exact wording and lineup can vary. One interpretation is that when you read any version of the King List, you are reading an editorial decision. Not a modern editor with a red pen, but ancient scribes choosing which names to include which city sequences to emphasize and how to arrange reign lengths. It's possible that different communities valued different traditions, and the list is a compromise or a statement depending on where and when it was copied. Historians still argue whether differences between King List versions reflect simple scribal copying variation, deliberate political editing to support certain dynasties, or the merging of multiple local traditions into a single text that was never completely fixed. That debate is a gentle reminder that texts are living things. They move, they shift, they survive by changing just enough to remain useful. You step into a quiet archive room in your imagination. It smells like clay dust and old reeds. Shelves are lined with tablets, some intact, some broken, some with edges worn smooth. A scribe lifts one carefully, turning it to catch the lamplight. The wedges cast tiny shadows. Tap, press, lift. The scribe compares it to another tablet. The sequence of kings matches for a while, then diverges. A name is spelled slightly differently. A reign length varies. A city order shifts. The scribe frowns not because the past is wrong, but because the copy must be consistent. This is your first light joke for the section, because you have just discovered that ancient scribes dealt with version control, except instead of GitHub, they had Clay Hub, and the merge conflicts were literal conflicts, like, no, your wedge is wrong. Now we have two different reign totals, and everybody is going to argue at the next meeting. Most historians agree that translation and interpretation shape how we understand ancient texts. The evidence we do have points to Sumerian and Akkadian terms that carry nuance, and to modern scholars working with fragmentary tablets. One interpretation is that small choices in translation can influence big conclusions, especially when people are looking for mystery. It's possible that when a term is ambiguous, readers are tempted to pick the most dramatic meaning. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Ambiguity does not mean anything goes. It means we have to be cautious. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. A careful reading might suggest that some modern claims lean too hard on uncertain translations, or on blending sources that were not originally meant to be read as one seamless narrative. Now, this is where this King List becomes both fascinating and dangerous for the imagination. Fascinating because variation suggests history is complex. Dangerous because variation gives modern rumor room to run. If two versions disagree, the rumor says, aha, the truth is being hidden. But a more cautious explanation could be that scribal tradition naturally produces variation, especially over centuries. It's possible that differences reflect local pride, pedagogical adaptation, or simple copying error. rather than deliberate concealment. Historians still argue whether modern claims about suppressed truths in Mesopotamian texts are grounded in the evidence or mostly reflect modern storytelling habits that treat every textual gap as a conspiracy. That debate is another safety rail. It keeps you from turning uncertainty into certainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and we are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues. You watch the scribe in the archive room set one tablet down and pick up another. This one has a cracked corner. The missing part is like a missing tooth in a smile. The scribe traces the break with a fingertip and sighs. They do not know what the missing line said. They can guess. They can compare with other copies. They can reconstruct carefully. But the break remains a break. This is your second light joke because you are now realizing that history is basically a puzzle where half the pieces are under the couch, and the couch is 3,000 years old, and also the couch is made of mud, and also someone flooded the room. Good luck. Most historians agree that the Sumerian King List exists within a broader Mesopotamian tradition of King List chronicles and literary compositions. The evidence we do have points to a scribal culture that valued continuity and order. One interpretation is that the King List's power is not only in its content, but in its form. It trains you to accept a sequence. It gives you a chain. It makes kingship feel like one continuous river. Now we step into the mist gently. A fringe idea proposes that textual variations in the King List are evidence of intentional manipulation to hide references to non-human rulers, sometimes linked to modern Anunnaki theories. This theory isn't widely accepted. To be clear, this is debated, and the evidence we do have does not confirm hidden Anunnaki lines erased from official copies. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic mood. What if the list's differences reflect not conspiracy, but the way humans reshape stories to fit the needs of power? And the result feels mysterious because it is human. A popular rumor claims that modern translators intentionally sanitize or mistranslate terms to suppress uncomfortable truths. The evidence is thin for broad claims of intentional suppression across scholarship. A more cautious explanation could be that translation is hard source material, is fragmentary, and interpretive disagreements are normal. People argue because the evidence is incomplete, not because everyone is in a secret club. Back on solid ground, you return to the practical side of reading. A careful reading might suggest that the best approach is layered. You separate what is broadly accepted from what is interpretive. You notice where the tablets agree and where they diverge. You allow uncertainty to remain uncertainty. This is not less satisfying. It is more honest. It lets you enjoy the story without forcing it into a single hidden truth. This is your third light joke, because if you tried to run a modern business with the same evidence standards as ancient history, you would be like, according to this broken receipt, we may or may not have sold 40 sheep, and the CFO would simply evaporate. You let the archive room fade, and you carry one last image with you, a scribe smoothing wet clay, preparing to copy again. The act of copying is an act of choice. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that multiple versions exist, and translation shapes understanding. The interpretation is that variation reflects scribal culture, local tradition, and political context. The imagined part is you walking through an archive at night, hearing the soft scrape of clay, and feeling how the past survives, not as a perfect recording, but as a careful human chorus of copies. The archive room closes behind you like a quiet book, and you step back into the open night where the air feels cleaner, emptier, and more honest. The stars are still there. The river is still there somewhere beyond the dark. The reed stylus sound is still there, too faint, but steady like a heartbeat you only notice when everything else is quiet. Now you ask the question that always waits beneath lists and numbers and royal titles. Why write this at all? Most historians agree that ancient states used text to organize authority, preserve memory, and legitimize rule. Archaeology suggests that writing in Mesopotamia served both practical administration and ideological messaging. And the evidence we do have points to rulers and institutions using narrative to make power feel natural. A king list in that context is not just a record, it is a tool. It tells you who belongs in the story of leadership, and it tells you how leadership is supposed to move. One interpretation is that the Sumerian King List is designed to create unity from competition. It's possible it was useful in times when city-states needed a shared framework, a way to say, yes, we fight, yes, we rival, but we are all part of one ancient chain of kingship. A careful reading might suggest that the list offers continuity as a political medicine. It makes the world feel less fragmented. You walk through a street where people are closing shop for the night. A vendor stacks bowls. A child is carried home half asleep. A worker rinses dust from their hands in a shallow basin. None of them are thinking about 241,200 years. They are thinking about tomorrow's water, tomorrow's bread, tomorrow's taxes. This is your first light joke for the section, because it is very human to build cosmic narratives and then immediately worry about whether you left the lamp burning. Most historians agree that daily life required stability, and the evidence we do have points to rulers being judged, at least in part, on their ability to maintain order, irrigation, and temple obligations. One interpretation is that a king list is a promise. It says leadership is continuous, therefore the world is continuous, therefore you can plan. It's possible that even if the list is partly ideological, it still functions as a comfort object. A list is a blanket you can read. Historians still argue whether the king list was composed mainly as propaganda for a particular ruling house, as a broader theological statement about cosmic order and kingship, or as a scribal synthesis meant to reconcile regional histories into one authoritative tradition. That debate reminds you that texts have audiences. The list may have been meant for elites, for scribes, for priests, for court ritual, for students, or for all of them at different times. One interpretation is that it works because it can be used in multiple settings. It's possible that a scribe copies it to learn writing, a priest recites it to anchor order, and a ruler cites it to claim legitimacy. Same text, different uses, same quiet effect. Kingship feels inevitable. Now the list structure itself tells you what it wants. It begins with sacred scale. It passes through the flood as a reset. It moves kingship from city to city as a neat relay. It gives you a chain that looks like law. A careful reading might suggest that the list is performing a worldview, one universe, one kingship, one rightful sequence. That does not mean reality was that tidy. It means the list wants you to desire tidiness. Let me rephrase that more carefully so we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The evidence we do have points to real cities, real institutions, and real rulers, at least in later sections, but the list is also a literary composition. It's possible that the mythic portions are included not as literal biography, but as a sacred foundation. This might support the idea that the list aims to connect present authority to primordial authority. It is suggestive, not conclusive, but it fits how ancient ideology often operates. Now we step into the mist gently. A fringe idea proposes that the King List was written as a coded warning or record for future generations, preserving hidden knowledge about the true origins of kingship, sometimes tied to modern Anunnaki theories. This theory isn't widely accepted. To be clear, this is debated, and the evidence we do have does not confirm a hidden message intended for modern readers. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still serve as cinematic mood. What if the story is pointing at something else, like a deep anxiety about power, a feeling that rulership comes from forces beyond ordinary people, whether those forces are divine, institutional, or mythic? A popular rumor claims that certain kings or cities were deliberately emphasized because of secret sacred geography, star alignments, or lost technologies. The evidence is thin. A more cautious explanation could be that cities are emphasized because they were politically significant, religiously prestigious, or educationally central, and that later imagination adds the extra sparkle. Back on solid ground, you notice something quietly revealing. The list is obsessed with continuity. Even when it admits a disruption like the flood, it restores kingship as if the institution cannot be broken. One interpretation is that this reflects a deep need. People want the world to have a spine, even when lived experience feels like a pile of loose reeds. It's possible that the list is less about the past and more about controlling the future, because if you can convince people that authority is ancient and orderly, you reduce resistance. This is your second light joke, because the list is basically the ultimate argument from tradition. It is saying, this is how it has always been for tens of thousands of years. So please stop asking questions and go back to work. That is not a critique. It is an observation of how power speaks. Now let the scene widen. You picture a festival in a city courtyard. Lamps everywhere. Music. Offerings. Officials in better clothing than the average worker. A priest recites names with a steady cadence, and the crowd hears the chain of kingship like a sacred spine. The sound is hypnotic. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. The list becomes a chant. One interpretation is that recitation turns history into ritual. It's possible that repeating the chain publicly reinforces social order, because order is not only built with walls and canals, it is built with shared stories. Historians still argue whether public recitation of king traditions served mostly religious devotion, mostly political theater, or a blend that made authority feel both sacred and socially necessary. Now you feel the truth ladder under your feet without needing to label it. Documented ancient states used text to legitimize rule and organize memory. Interpreted the King List stitches messy politics into a single authoritative chain to create unity and stability. Imagined a night festival where names drift over the crowd like smoke and the institution of kingship feels older than fear. This is your third light joke, because somewhere in that crowd is a person who only came for the food and is now stuck listening to a very long list of names thinking, wow, this is the original award show speech that refuses to end. You let the festival lights dim in your imagination, and you keep walking forward into the last stretch of the journey, carrying the sense that the list exists because people needed it. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The list does not only tell you who ruled, it tells you what kind of world the writers wanted to live in ordered, continuous, sanctioned, and safe enough to plan tomorrow. You keep walking, and the night becomes softer around the edges, as if the world is turning down its own volume to help you rest. The stars feel farther away now, not because they moved, but because you are no longer straining to decode them. The river's presence is still there somewhere, a slow, unseen sound beneath everything, like your fan hum blending into the background until it becomes part of your breathing. The clay tablet is still in your hand in imagination. It has weight. It has warmth. It has the calm stubbornness of something that does not care whether you agree with it. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. That little sound is your final thread back to the beginning, the simplest technology of memory. Most historians agree that the Sumerian King List preserves a mixture of mythic and historical material, naming real cities and later rulers in ways that intersect with other Mesopotamian traditions, while also presenting early reign lengths that are not plausible as literal human years. Archaeology suggests that early Mesopotamian urban life and temple institutions were real and complex, and the evidence we do have points to scribes shaping texts to preserve order, legitimacy, and worldview. That is the solid ground, and it is enough ground to stand on without needing to pretend we can see every detail. One interpretation is that the King List is a cultural machine that turns chaos into sequence. It's possible it was designed to be recited, copied, remembered, and trusted, not because every line is literal, but because the overall shape gives comfort. The list teaches you that kingship descends, survives floods, moves city to city, and continues. It teaches that the world has a spine. And what if that spine is less about kings and more about the human need to believe the future will still have structure? Historians still argue whether the King List's mythic reigns should be read mainly as symbolic numerology, as a genre marker that separates sacred time from human time, or as political theater that magnifies the antiquity of authority to make later rule feel inevitable. That debate does not have to keep you awake. It can stay gently open like a window cracked for cool air. You look back across the imagined landscape you have walked tonight. You see the first city mood of Eridu, the sense of beginnings wrapped in temple light. You see the flood line like a hinge in the story, a way to reset memory without admitting the archive is fragile. You see Uruk's walls real enough to feel, and Gilgamesh's name sitting between record and epic, half history, half dream. You see scribal schoolrooms, students pressing wedges into clay, learning not only letters, but legitimacy. You see dynasties stitched into one chain as if politics is tidy. You see the stars above it all, steady enough to make people want to align their rulers with cosmic order. Let me rephrase that more carefully, because it is easy to sound like we have solved something. We have not. We have followed clues. We have noticed patterns. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. This is your first light joke of the section, and it is meant to be sleepy. The King List is basically the ancient version of someone saying, "My family has been in charge forever and your family is just visiting." Except in this case, forever is written as 241,200 years, which is a pretty aggressive way to win an argument at dinner. Now, the Anunnaki linger in the story like distant lanterns in the fog. Most historians agree they are gods within Mesopotamian religion, and the evidence we do have does not confirm them as literal visitors or rulers in the way modern rumor sometimes claims. One interpretation is that modern Anunnaki theories grow in the gap between mythic language and historical curiosity. It's possible that the King List's vast timescales invite people to treat myth as a report because the numbers feel too deliberate to ignore. But if the evidence is thin, we will say so. And here the evidence is thin for turning the list into a literal record of non-human dynasties. A fringe idea proposes that the giant reigns reflect real, long-lived beings, and that the list is a surviving administrative trace of an age when rulers were not like us. This theory isn't widely accepted. To be clear, this is debated. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic what if, not a verdict. What if the story is pointing at something else, like the way early kingship felt supernatural because it was new, centralized, and enormous compared to village life? This is your second light joke, because when you imagine the first city administrators showing up with ration lists, tax demands, and temple schedules, it probably did feel like aliens had landed. A man appears and tells you how many jars of barley you owe. And you are like, "Who are you?" And he says, "Kingship descended from heaven." Honestly, it is bold. Back on solid ground, you can still appreciate the list for what it clearly is, a window into how Mesopotamians thought about time, authority, and order. The evidence we do have points to a world where writing emerges to manage complexity and where ideology and administration intertwine. One interpretation is that the King List is a masterpiece of social engineering, not in a sinister way, but in a practical way. It's possible that telling people a shared narrative of kingship helped unify communities across shifting political landscapes. Now you let the list become smaller, again, not in importance, but in feeling. It is not a mountain now. It is a single tablet on a shelf, quiet, patient, waiting for someone to read it. It cannot shout. It can only sit there and be heavy. Historians still argue whether the enduring appeal of the King List today comes more from its historical value, more from its literary structure, or more from the open spaces it leaves for modern imagination. And that is the gentle truth. The open spaces are part of the experience. You do not have to fill them with certainty. You can let them remain open and still feel wonder. Now the wind down begins and the pacing slows. Your steps become softer. The night around you becomes less like a stage and more like a blanket drawn up to your shoulders. The reed stylus sound fades until it is just a memory of rhythm, like rain you heard earlier in the evening. You picture a scribe setting down the stylus and flexing their fingers, not dramatically, just with the quiet relief of a person who has done careful work. The tablet dries, the wedges harden. Time, in a small way, is captured. You breathe in, and the air feels cool and clean, like a window cracked open. You breathe out, and your body loosens a little more. The cities of the list, Eridu, Kish, Uruk, and the others, are no longer places you have to understand. They are distant lamps along a river, each one glowing for a moment, and then fading behind the bend. The numbers, even the absurdly large ones, no longer demand your attention. They become like stars you notice without counting, present, steady, and far away. You remind yourself gently that some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are calm. What if imagination? And you have kept the solid ground separate from the mist. You have not been asked to believe anything tonight. You have only been invited to walk through an old landscape of words and clay and sky, and to let it feel large without needing it to be literal. And now you can let it go. You can let the reed stylus stop tapping. You can let the torch of kingship drift into the distance. You can let the floodlines settle into legend. You can let the Anunnaki remain what they are in the mainstream story gods, in a mythic assembly, luminous figures in a religion, not confirmed visitors. And you can still keep the wonder of the question in your pocket, light as a pebble. Your room is quiet. The fan hum is soft. your breathing is slower. The night outside your window, wherever you are in the world, feels wide and calm. If your thoughts try to grab onto a number again, you can smile and let it pass because you are not doing math tonight. You are resting,